Hey up, right, I thought we would just go through the braking procedure for the Honda GB350s today, how I've undertaken it, how it went, and my experience of the bike so far. I've done, 370 miles. And I think engine braking on any motorcycle is one of those sort of huge topics. I get questions every day about, various bikes and various aspects of motorcycle engine braking. And it's been a few years since I covered it in a video, so I thought we'd revisit that today, Honda GB350 style. And my experience of my bike compared to the press bike that I tested about 6 weeks ago now, because the experience of those two bikes were quite different, and I will cover in this video why I think that was. Now, there are a few other sort of comments and requests that have popped up in the comments over the last few weeks. One is battery tenders. I got a lot of complaints when I got the BSA that I didn't make a video on hooking a battery tender up to it. The main reason that I didn't do it is because, I've made those videos before and I thought people might be getting a bit bored of that sort of thing. And I just reused an old battery tender that I already had. Now, I have bought one in, so I will be covering the fitting of a battery tender to the Honda in the next few weeks. I'm not quite sure when. It's a brand that I've not tried before, but it's a brand whose name kept coming up in videos over the years, so hopefully that will please some people. And the other thing that I've been asked about a lot recently is the care of matte black exhausts and engines, because as we know, the exhausts especially have a habit of turning grey and then turning almost white on the headers before the paint starts to disintegrate and look pretty crap. So I have actually been testing a pre-production product for the last couple of weeks on the GB350s. So far I've found out that it works really well on the headers for up to 260 miles, which is better than any other product I've ever tried. The problem is, it is a pre-production product. It's not in full production yet, so I'm having to wait until the company involved actually pushes the button on it and has some stock on shelves, because there's no point me bringing it to your attention if you can't get hold of it. I know some people do get a little bit frustrated with me over certain subjects, because I'm not sort of presenting videos when they want to see them, but the thing is, I have to test most of my review items extensively before I can endorse them. Rest assured, I may only put 2 videos a week out, but I'm generally working on about 6 projects on top of those at any one time. Unless it's appropriate, I'm not generally in the habit of, receiving an item in the post in the morning, filming the review in the afternoon, and then publishing it the next day. That's not how I work. Right, engine braking on a new motorcycle, or any motor vehicle for that matter. I happen to think it's very important to do it properly. Now, actually, it's not just about braking in a new engine. It serves 3 purposes, really. One is braking in the engine. The other one is bedding in brakes, scuffing tyres off so that they're working optimally. So you keep the performance low for the first few hundred miles until, those components have sorted themselves out and they're working as they should. And it's also about braking in the rider, because when you buy a new bike, it's new to you, and you need to get accustomed to that bike before you start riding it faster. So those first few hundred miles of relatively slow riding benefit the rider enormously and helps to prevent mishaps. And then we come to the engine, which, when you talk about motorcycle braking, that's usually what everybody sort of talks about. It's braking in the engine. And this depends really on the skill and technical achievements of the manufacturer. Some are better than others. And there is a school of thought, especially on this channel in the comments, that modern engines no longer need to be broken in. Manufacturing tolerances are so good these days that it's just not necessary. I disagree. And this myth, unfortunately, is perpetuated by dealerships. I've lost count of the amount of cars or motorcycles I've bought over the years where I've asked about running procedure, And the response that I've got back from the salesman is, with modern vehicles it's just not necessary. And then you get home, open your manual up, and there it is, detailed braking procedures for your engine. Now, not all salesmen are the same. You know, some are good and they have the knowledge, some don't have the knowledge. It's just a job. They may have been selling washing machines 6 months ago, or forklift trucks. They don't actually know much at all about the motorcycle that they're selling to you, so they certainly don't know the intricacies of braking procedure. Always go to your manual. Don't trust what a salesman tells you. Now, having said that, when I popped the question to Andy at Miles Kingsport about the braking procedure for the GB350, he sort of recounted it to me off by heart. He had it submitted to memory, and it's probably about the first time in 10 or 15 years that I've encountered a salesman that was able to do that. Having said that, it's not complicated for the GB350. Now, before we get into it, I suppose we ought to discuss the Motorman method, something that sort of cropped up about 10 years ago, and various derivatives of it. The general opinion of this method is that you ride the bike hard from day one, do frequent oil changes in the first few hundred miles, allow it time to cool down in between sort of 20-mile hard runs, and you run your bike in perfectly in a fraction of the time normally associated with the manufacturer's recommendations. Now, this was a method used by some racing teams, or so we're led to believe, and as far as I'm concerned, this is just a perfect way to trash your new engine. Now, the demands of a racing machine are very different from the demands that are required from a daily runabout, a commuter, a tourer, or whatever. You need reliability, you need good fuel consumption, and you want to try and avoid excessive oil consumption if you can. The Motorman method may well loosen your engine up very quickly, but just bear in mind, during the course of one racing season, your average motorcycle engine will be stripped down and rebuilt several times. That's not something that you want to be doing with your new bike that you're going to be using for work or for touring or pleasure or whatever. And your average competition engine has a life of 3, maybe 4 years before it's scrap. Is that really what you want from your new motorcycle? Because it ain't what I want. What I want from any new motorcycle that I buy is tens of thousands of trouble-free, economical running before it needs any attention. And a proper braking procedure of a new motorcycle engine goes a long way to making sure that you achieve that. Now, as I said earlier on, the running procedure is determined by basically the quality of manufacture of the engine. Some manufacturers are better at it than others. Most of the motorcycles that I've purchased over the last 40 years or so have required quite lengthy braking procedures, usually of about 1,000 or 1,200 miles. And it's usually broken up into 2 parts: an initial 500 or 600 miles of slow running, followed by an oil change, followed by a further 500 or 600 miles of slightly faster running, but not using sort of optimal performance, or should I say maximum performance. Now, this is necessary because when a new engine is built, it's using components that have never worked with each other before. They need to rub up against each other, they need to create friction, they need to create a sort of controlled wear that allows everything to run perfectly and harmoniously. And in the first few hundred miles of an engine's life, they simply don't do that. Every component in that new motor, the piston rings, the cylinder, all the different sort of cogs, wheels and pulleys have tiny microscopic machine marks from the manufacturing process on them, and those machine marks need to be worn smooth, and until that happens the engine will be tight. Each component will be fighting against each other until a sort of equilibrium is achieved, and that's what the running in process is all about. So when that engine is new, the biggest danger is the production of heat from that additional friction that it's achieving, which, you know, in the past it could lead to sort of engine seizures, although you don't hear of that very often nowadays. And the manufacturer tailors a run-in regime or braking regime that achieves that wearing process in a controlled manner without causing damage. Now, that's not so much of a problem on a large capacity, high performance motorcycle, because even the initial slow running stages, often, you know, the bike's capable of travelling well in excess of legal speed limits, and by the time you reach the second phase, you're talking about speeds that are really only appropriate for the racetrack. So the running procedure for those larger bikes never really is a problem for the new owner, because they're able to ride it normally. But smaller capacity motorcycles like the Honda 350 or the Royal Enfield 350s, the terminal velocity when fully run in is only 70 or 80 miles an hour. So, you know, those initial slow running periods can be really tedious. Travelling around at the first 500 or 600 miles at 40 miles an hour isn't much fun. And then after the first service at 500 or 600 miles, whatever it happens to be, another 500 or 600 miles of travelling around at 50 miles an hour, although, you know, a bit of a relief to start with, soon becomes soul destroying. Now, you know, in the old days, I look back to my youth, my motorcycle was my only mode of transport, so 1,000 to 1,200 miles was a month of normal sort of running about. But a lot of people nowadays, they buy these bikes as a toy. They just ride it on weekends during the summer, and for some of them it can take an entire year to complete the break-in of the new motorcycle. And I know from talking to some of these people, they often end up selling them before they've even completed the running period because they're just tired of it. Now, I know a lot of people don't believe me when I say that people end up selling their 350 Royal Enfields because they're fed up of, you know, the break-in period, but have a look online at used bikes 1 to 2 years old, just how many bikes there are up for sale with less than the 1,200 mile running period achieved on the odometer. There are lots of them. Now, I've not bought a new Japanese motorcycle for, must be getting on for 30 years now, and I've got to admit I'm a little bit out of date with the running procedures. I'm presuming the main Japanese manufacturers are all round about the same, because they all have a similar reputation for technology, quality of manufacture and design excellence. So it was a bit of an eye-opener for me when I discovered that the entire running period for the Honda GB350s, and I'm told for most of the Honda range, is only 300 miles. After which time you can ride the bike normally. Now, the short running procedure goes something like this. During the first 300 miles, avoid full throttle, avoid rapid down changes, and ride conservatively. That's it. Now, I've got to admit that after almost 30 years of running in BMWs, Triumphs, and more recently Royal Enfield, this didn't feel right to me. But the way I rationalised it is that if Honda are now willing to give up to 6 years manufacturer's parts and labour warranty with these bikes, providing you have them serviced on time at Honda approved dealerships, they obviously have a lot of faith in their design and precision and quality of manufacture. And I have to confess that having followed it, because I've completed this running procedure now, I have a bike which is certainly more lively and smoother than the press bike that I had a few weeks ago, and I'll cover why in a few minutes. But I have to say, that sort of very short explanation of how to run these bikes in does leave an awful lot to the imagination. Now, avoiding rapid down changes, yeah, I mean that's obvious. You just avoid crashing down through the gearbox because you haven't been paying attention and you've been caught unawares by somebody stopping abruptly in front of you. The components in the gearbox need time to smooth off and wear in, and rushing it in the early stages of the bike's life is not a good thing. We all know what riding conservatively means, although some people might have a different idea of what is conservative compared to other people. But the advice of avoiding using full throttle is wildly open to interpretation. I mean, 90 or 99% of throttle use isn't full throttle, is it? Or only using 10% of your throttle isn't full throttle. But, what does Honda mean by that? What is the happy medium? Now, I settled on about 75% of throttle use in the first 300 miles. Now, the engine is still understandably tight when it's new. It has to be. What I discovered is at 40 miles an hour, in the first 2 or 3 miles, if you engaged fifth gear, the bike quite simply couldn't manage it. It was complaining. So my advice is avoid fifth gear for the first 10 or 20 miles. You have no rev counter, so you have to rely on what gear you're in and what speed you're travelling at. And I settled on this. In first gear, change into second at somewhere between 10 and 15 miles per hour. In second gear, change into third gear at between 20 and 25 miles per hour. Now, changing from third into fourth should be carried out at round about 30 to 35 miles per hour, and you can usually get into top gear, fifth gear, sometime after 40 miles an hour. I mean, by the time the bike had 30 or 40 miles on it, it would happily accept fifth gear at 40 miles an hour, and it would accelerate, not fast, but it would accelerate from there up to a terminal velocity of 50 miles per hour during that initial braking period. Now, I settled on these speeds based on sort of feedback through the chassis of the bike, vibration, of which there is very little, and the sound of the engine. I mean, you can tell when this engine is being laboured, and it's important that you don't allow it to labour or lug. That will likely cause more engine damage or premature wear than over-revving it. Now, I'm saying this because over the years I've encountered so many people who, they may be fairly new to motorcycling, I don't know, or new to having a new bike. The priority is often to get into top gear as quickly as possible because they don't want to over-rev the engine, and what they actually do is they end up putting way too much load on the engine because they're changing up into higher gears prematurely and make life difficult for the engine. I mean, if you look back to when you was a kid and you had a bicycle or push bike or pedal cycle, whatever you want to call it, that had gears on it, if you set off in first gear, it was very easy to get going. And if you changed up correctly through the gears, you could keep the momentum up without sort of overloading your leg muscles. But if you got it wrong and you tried to set off in one of the higher gears, you could literally stand on the pedals and put your whole body weight into it, busting a gut, and you would find it really difficult to get the bike moving. And that is what happens to the engine on a motorcycle if you change up prematurely, and that will cause more damage to your engine than over-revving it. So make sure that throughout your gear changes the engine is able to rev smoothly and freely, and you're not putting too much load on it. That's the most important thing. Now, I would also advise not sticking at one speed. I know it used to be traditional back in the 70s of buying a bike from a dealership sort of 200 miles away and then just battering down the motorway at one speed all the way home, and then when you took it back doing the same thing, the bike was ready for its first service. That's not good for the bike. You need to work up and down through the gearbox, and you need to vary your engine speeds. That doesn't mean, you know, sitting there, as I've seen people doing, just revving the engine in gear and then bringing it back down again and taking it. That's ridiculous. Just follow the speed limits for the area that you're in. Stick to them rigidly. You should anyway, but by doing that, you're automatically varying the engine speed and you're working through the gearbox. You're giving everything a healthy workout without sort of doing anything weird, as I see people do from time to time. Now, treating my bike in this manner, I noticed sort of sometimes after the 200-mile mark, the bike wanted to be off. You know, you could feel it in the engine. It was willing, it was able, and it wanted to go faster. So rather than the 50-mile-an-hour top speed in top gear, I started sort of pushing it up to 50, sometimes even 60 miles an hour, just for the last 80 or 100 miles of running. And just to put that into perspective, it was probably only about 10% of that last 80 or 100 miles. You know, it was all down to the prevailing road conditions and whether it was possible to do that. And during that period, I realised that this bike, compared to that press bike that I had from Honda a few weeks ago, it was much more lively than that press bike. And I think I know why, and this is why proper braking procedures are important. Now, the first couple of days that I was riding that press bike, I was quite impressed with it. I mean, you know, the review was a positive one. It certainly outperforms the Royal Enfield 350s. But I had a query about the rev limiter on the bike, so I rode in 2 miles kicksport and I had a chat with Andy about it. And I think, to be honest, he misunderstood the question that I was asking. And we went outside, he started the bike up and he revved it a few times, and he commented that it seemed a little bit sluggish compared to, you know, most of the GB350s that he had knowledge of. Now, at that time, I had nothing to compare it with, so I just had to take what he was telling me. But it was when running my bike in, as I say, especially during that last 80 or 100 miles of running, I realised that my bike actually performs much better than the press bike that I had. Now, as you know, I don't watch reviews prior to reviewing a bike, but I do have a sneak peek after I've published my reviews just to see how it compares with what other people have said. And although it didn't show the registration number of the bike, I watched one of the reviews which was based on the actual press bike that I'd had, because it had 800 miles on it by the time I got it. Now, you didn't see the registration plate, but there were some telltale marks on the bike that allowed me to identify it as the bike that I'd been riding. There was a dent in the tank and there was some, you know, scratches and various other distinguishing marks around the bike. Press bikes have a hard life. Now, I'm not criticising the journalist that was reviewing the bike, because I know what it's like. Quite often, if you're the first person to get a new press bike, you're lucky if it's got any more than 40 miles on the clock. You know, they are virtually brand new. Now, in their case, they're working for a magazine or whatever. They don't have time to run a bike in properly before they put it through its paces. They're on a deadline. They've got to come up with a publication within the time slot that's made available to them. So they just have to ride the bike to its full extent right from day one, even if it's only got a mile on the odometer when it reaches them, in order to complete the necessary review that they have to perform for their employer. And it quickly became obvious to me that, you know, he actually stated that he'd run the bike in for Honda because of the mileage that was on it when he got the bike, and he also commented that he was only getting 60 mpg out of the bike. Well, I'm getting a clear 100 mpg out of my bike, and have done all through the time I've been running it in. And in the 70 miles since I completed the running procedure, and I've been riding the bike pretty hard, it's only dropped down to about 99.7 mpg. So this guy must have been pushing that bike really, really hard to only achieve an average of 60 mpg. I think that's the problem. The bike had not been running properly, and I believe that had caused a compression problem. I suspect the piston rings hadn't sealed properly, and there were maybe one or two other issues as well, because my bike is noticeably more energetic than the press bike that I had. Now, the other thing that tipped me off about this on that press bike is that when the technician delivered it, he apologised for a little bit of spilled oil around the oil filler, because he'd had to top it up just before bringing it out to me. Bearing in mind it had 800 miles on it, and it would have had an oil change at 500 or 600 miles. It had burnt a substantial amount of oil in 200 or 300 miles. In comparison, I checked the oil on my bike and it was at the maximum, I think, when I had about 30 or 40 miles on the clock. And I checked it yesterday with 370 miles on the clock, and it was still at the maximum mark, and the oil was sparkling clean. So yeah, there's obviously a big difference between the two bikes, and as I've said, you know, that demonstrates the importance of sensibly running a bike in. I mean, that press bike will probably run for another 10 or 15 years, but you know, its performance will always be slightly compromised. It will probably need some remedial work quite early on in its life. It will always burn some oil, and it will always consume more fuel than it should. That's just how it goes. Once again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this and my other videos, and in doing so helping to support this channel. I really do appreciate it. I will of course be back on Friday, so until then, please ride safely, and I'll see you soon.